Do you want to build a guitar that is as smooth to the touch as much or even more than it sounds? The look of your guitar is going to be judged even before it's plugged in, so to get the most out of your hard work, stay with me. We'll go step by step until it's smooth as a... Hi, I'm Yoav and this is the Electric Luthier. While there are a few select luthiers who find the act of sanding a sort of Zen meditation, most of us just want to get it done with. We also know that of all the hard work you put in, this is the most noticeable part. So what we need is to find the method for sanding and smoothing in the quickest and the most efficient way we can. Now, what are the essential steps to smoothing the surface of a guitar? You want to prepare the surface for sanding. You want to add stains, dyes, or color. You need to understand what is the finest grit you can start with. You want to move through the grits to the finest grit you want the finish to be with. And then you're done. Now you may think this is nothing new and it would still take forever and be just as frustrating, and that would be partly true, but understanding the method would get you through sanding more efficiently and without wasting time and effort. So what is sanding anyway? When we sand, we actually remove all the material around our deepest scratches and grooves. The amount and depth of our starting point will depend on whatever form of shaping or smoothing we had before. For example, if we were shaping a neck with a rasp saw, we would have much deeper scratches than a surface we'd planed. This is why your methods and tools for shaping, cutting, or preparing the various parts will have a great effect on your sanding even before you start. A scraper, for example, can get you to a smoothness level above 100 grit sandpaper, and sometimes with a sharp blade, even close to 220 grits. Let's talk about grits. The basic principle is that the higher the number, the finer the finish. I like to divide them into three groups. The exact division can be debatable. Up to about 100 are the rougher ones. These are great for moderate shaping and leveling, removing tool marks and very deep cuts. Between 180 and 800 grits are the ones good for smoothing your surface and preparation for finishing. When we talk about 1000 and up, although some would say 600 and up, we're finishing and polishing. There's really no need to sand the actual wood to 4-digit grit if you're going to put any kind of finish on it, including oils. There are a couple of numbering systems, but as long as you stick to one of them or just a certain manufacturer or sandpaper, you should be fine. There are also a few types of materials from which they're made, but the principle and grits are pretty much the same. Let's take a close look at those scratches. The short, lighter lines are the grain itself. I've sanded against the grain to make it more visible and apparent. With a 60 grit paper, you can hardly make out the direction of the grain, and the scratches are very deep. It looks like a mess. At 80 grit, we start to make out the grain from the scratches. At 100 grit, you can start seeing the surface between the scratches, and at 240 grit to 600, you can see the scratches slowly disappearing. These will probably be filled with any type of oil or lacquer you'll layer on it. Only at 1200 grit, you can actually see the grain with no visible scratches at all. By the way, this is blown up poplar, so other woods would behave slightly differently. Now this does not mean you need to sand to 1200 grit, but we'll get to that in a bit. When we sand, we actually want to get to the bottom of our deepest scratches. If we have very deep scratches, let's say equivalent to a rasp saw, a rough file, a dull blade, or even something like a 60 grit sandpaper, we need to tackle it with roughness to match. If you jump on that with a 400 grit paper, you'll exhaust your hands, go through a full stack of sandpaper, and maybe burn your sander. And you will literally just scratch the surface. Sanding is about removing as much material and getting to the bottom of those scratches in the quickest way, and we do that by making new shallower scratches and shallower scratches again. Now where do we start then? The key here is to visually assess the surface and decide what to start with. If we start too low, we're just going to make things worse and take ourselves a step back. Starting too high will not be effective. Do a local test and feel the area. Is it smoother than the surrounding area? Now take a close look. You may have smoothed the surface but left some deeper visible scratches which will require going back to a lower grit. This may be a local issue or over the whole surface. So after you've found the correct starting point and fixed any localized issues, the hardest part is leveling the whole surface to this grit. Depending on the type of wood and the quality of the sandpaper, it's smooth sailing from here on. The next grit up will require less effort to even everything out, and the next one up even less. The more grits you use, and with smaller increments, the more even your surface will be and the less effort you'll need with each layer. Each sheet will also last you much longer. Now I know you're probably thinking, I can surely skip some grits in the middle and go straight up to the final grit once we get started and see some smoothness. Do resist. You will need to sand much longer, go through more sanding paper, and often need to go back to lower grits if you skip too high. The rule of thumb is to jump less than twice your grit number and preferably 150%. Less is always better. So for example, at 80, go to 100 or 120. At 120, go to either 220 and no higher than 240. And then skip no further than 400. If you add 320 at the middle, even better. From 400 you can jump to 600 and you will probably not need the 800. The good news here is that you will end up spending much less time sanding per grit. As a tip, it's a good idea to thoroughly clean the surface when moving up with the grit size. Aside from dust particles, you may also have some sandpaper grains from the lower grit. These will scratch the surface if they get between the sandpaper and your wood. Now, how do you know when to move up to the next grit? Well, other than just looking at the scratches and seeing when the biggest scratches disappear, you can lightly use a pencil to draw lines covering the whole sanding area. When these lines disappear, you have removed another layer. Now, if you have skipped to a grit too high, you may still remove most of the pencil marks, but not the scratches themselves. So be aware, no cheating. Your other hand is also a good indicator. Even if you like using gloves when working, you should always have the non-sanding hand gloveless to feel the surface. Now, if you find this helpful to make the best out of your sanding experience, please let me know in the comments and other methods below. And you can find much more information on my website, theelectricluthier.com, as well as these videos. And until next time, don't just watch videos. Go ahead, build a guitar.